That's the music of the legendary Junes Dopo, Sweet Cassava Leaf, Not for Good Alone. Welcome again to Focus on Liberia. We are discussing uh, the history around the name Monrovia. Should Monrovia be renamed to its original name first? It was Duko or Trubo or Dubo. Later, it was Crystal Palace, then Monrovia. In the wake of the George Floyd incident, we sparked again the debate of getting rid of some Confederate monuments and other institutions in the United States. That protest has spread across the world. And in Liberia, the debate to rename Monrovia to its original name, Duco, has resurfaced. And so we have had people debating that. Today, we're going to look at the history. Liberia was, founded by free slaves. So settlers went to Liberia, or ex-slaves went to Liberia and then established the country and gave most of the names. Now, there are some people calling for those names to be changed because James Monroe, they said, was a slave master and the country's capital should not be named after him. So tonight we're going to deal into the history of the ACS, that's the American Colonization Society. We're going to look at James Monroe himself and his role in the founding of Liberia. And then we look at that colonial period, that is the period from 1817 to 1845, just before independence. Then we look at the name Monrovia itself and other names in Liberia. To discuss this, we have Professor Dr. Herbert Brewer, who's joining us. Dr. Brewer, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you for having me.
I also have my co-host, also part of Focus on Liberia, Mr. William Thomas Bernard King. William, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you.
All right. So, Dr. Brewer, we are glad to have you. I think you heard about the debate, you saw it, and this is nothing new. So today we want to go into the history. Just a few words. I know you're Associate Professor of History at Morgan State University. You're also a historian of the Atlantic world, and your research has been on slavery. Also a fellow at George Washington. Little more about Dr. Brewer, if you don't mind.
Oh, you wanted to say something about me?
Yes.
somebody who spent part of my childhood, in fact, most of it, in Cinco Fiamma. I think that's important for people to know in terms of background. And always been a supporter of Mighty Barrow. I think that's important too. I have actually been, studying this part of history of the Liberian history for a very long time, for a considerable amount of time. And what I'd be more than happy to do is to share with people some of my insights, some of the knowledge I have. I think it's important for us to broaden the scope of the discussion. Usually, over the past 40 years, because this is the length of my own engagement with this topic, we see that people tend to narrow the discussions to personalities for the most part. When it's something much bigger, people tend not to look at structures as one issue. I'd like to kind of put up there right away. Also, we tend to, again, I was on a show before, I kind of discussed it a bit, but I'll keep repeating it for people to kind of understand what kind of way of approaching things, a historical way of looking at things historically and what that means, to look at something historically. And it means, of course, putting yourself in the context and in the place, in the position of the people you're talking about from the past, not seeing the past strictly from today's vantage point. Because what tends to happen is that we assume certain things. We think that because some particular event is taking place today, or a particular set of circumstances exist today, that these circumstances are the inevitable, important word, inevitable outcome of actions people took before, but actually that's not necessarily the case. One of the things that happens when you study history is you see the extent to which there are many times unintended consequences There's an old phrase that many will be familiar with. It says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in many ways, people make decisions, sometimes at the spur of the moment, sometimes in a state of crisis, and then something else happens as a result. You think one thing and then something else happens. And there are just lots of those examples from Liberian history. I'd be more than happy to raise some of them for folks to consider. But also, one last thing by way of introduction, I think that it's important for us to be clear about some of the terminology that we use when we try to discuss these phenomena, try to discuss the past, even the present as well. And I can take them one at a time as we go. But right off the bat, even the terminology of tribe is such a problematic concept, and I wouldn't mind going into it a bit to discuss its inadequacy, its flaws, and in fact, I may go beyond that and say that even that word and that concept of tribe, it is fraught with history, and it represents it creates more confusion than clarification and clarity, actually. And for Liberians, I think it's important. It's sometimes used every day, but people should understand what goes with it. Last thing is, of course, this notion of nation building and nation state, and how I think oftentimes as well, people use the term state and nation interchangeably. And perhaps we need some more clarity there, unpack some of those terms, because we use that language, we use those words, thinking that it means one thing when it oftentimes means something else. So some conceptual clarity has to go along with trying to understand that past and how it impacts us today. But again, so I circle back around to that point of looking for context. All of these things, whether you're discussing the ACS or you're discussing Monrovia, you need larger context. And I'd be more than happy to provide, I think, some of that larger context. So I'm not, so do you want me to start off with some of that larger context? I'm not, I think you.
No, sure. I want just William to give his introductory comments, and then we can start.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dennis, for having me on the show. Full disclaimer, I am a part of Focus on Liberia, Dr. Abira. I am more here as a co-host, but even as a young Liberian, the discussion around the ACS, James Monroe, Liberia as independence, the settlers, the American Liberian, and so forth, have been quite a bit of conversations that we often have as Liberians. And depending on the time of the year or what's going on within that time context, it may carry a political agenda, it may carry a economic agenda, or it may invoke some strong sentiments. So I am just here really wanting to kind of listen here and learn. And something that you did touch on that I think that I'll be really focusing on and keening on, you mentioned something about the context of the time. And I think you mentioned that in a different way when you talked about circumstances, how certain things take place back then and so forth. And so, it's just an honor, and I'll really look forward to just listening. And I may ask a few questions here and there, but for the most part, we're here to, to promote all things Liberia, educate, elevate, and promote. Thank you.
Thank you, William. And so, Dr. Brewer, let's start like this. And this is the context, because Liberia, as we learned from our history book, was founded by the American Colonization Society. And so what we want to know, or what the debate has been about, is who really is the ACS? What was their intent? And what was the discussion going on at that time that precipitated the repatriation of ex-slaves from here to Liberia? So let's talk about ACS and the history behind them.
Okay, so the first thing I would say really is that the ACS is actually not the center of Liberian history. And no matter which way you look at it, it's not the center of Liberia's history. And that the history of the Liberian people does not start in 1822. But of course, it's way before that. Common sense would suggest that to you. The history of the Liberian people doesn't start with the formation of the ACS either. And part of the problem with Liberian history, which is, of course, again tied up with, as well with issues of Liberia's national identity, is that the ACS has been put into the center of that history. And so, if I may coin a phrase, Liberia tends to have a sort of ACS-centric history, and therefore an American-centric history, a history centered around the United States. And that is a problem. It's a difficulty for Liberians and for people who discuss and argue about Liberian history. Now, no fault of yours, but here we are. And the general way that Liberian history is introduced is that, oh, you started this organization called the ACS. They're the subject. This organization called the ACS, created this place, when that's the wrong place to start. In the context of the United States, the ACS is kind of not really in the center of things. It's there, but it's not even in the center of things. In the context of Liberia itself, even more importantly, it's not in the center of things. It played a role, but it played a minor role. That's my argument. Their ACS played it played an important role. Indeed, many ways you could say it played a role that was indispensable in a whole variety of ways, but that still doesn't make it the major role, the major actor in the drama of Liberia. And I think that kind of perspective is important if Liberians wish to develop a sort of national identity, right, that centers them, centers their ancestors in this story, in the creation. So Liberia, for Liberia to be seen as a product of the actions of Liberian people or their ancestors, you have to start with them. Once you start with the ACS, it puts the Liberian people themselves into the margins. That's the and if you turn to history to support the development of your national identity, which is kind of why people turn to history in many ways, because they kind of think about identity, you will find yourself running up against a wall if you always start with someone else. So that's a kind of broad challenge that I'm throwing out there. I know it is extremely difficult for Liberians to let go of the ACS and the ACS obsession. If you look into the archives of the ACS, a place again that I've worked in, and when I say the archives of the ACS, for those out there, I'm not speaking of a building called the ACS Archives. I mean the papers, the way knowledge has been ordered, because that's what archives do. They order knowledge. This is what's important. This is not important. That sort of thing. It classifies what is valuable and what is not valuable. What type of knowledge we should seek and which type we should avoid, or how archives also, for example, silence the actions of people. So that, as an example, talking about the ACS archives, Jehudi Ashman, is like the star of the ACS archive. He really is. If you're thoroughly looking at the archives as they stand, Jehudi Ashman is this saintly figure and this star in those archives. So if you're just simply basing how you write your history on that sort of thing, on that order of knowledge, then of course Jehudi Ashman and the rest of them become important people, central people to the being, to the existence, to the creation and foundation of Liberia. And that's not the case. It is people have used different ways to describe that sort of relationship. Talk about a colonial relationship, and that's part of that colonial relationship if you kind of think about it. Some people use that phrase of a colonial mentality, where you think that your validation comes from somebody else out there. You're looking to them to approve you, to put their stamp of approval sort of on you, and you get your legitimization, right, from what they do and what they say and those sorts of things. So I'm going even further beyond just simply a matter of who established Liberia, and I'm talking about the way that that this history has been passed down to us,
Right.
and the kinds of figures we collectively look to for validation. Now, who are our authority figures? Who say that this is what happened, and then that becomes okay. That's the truth because that man said it. That sort of thing. And we to put it in a kind of colloquial way or a way that Liberians will understand. The white man says so, so that's so. That becomes a central challenge to people who are looking at Liberian history. Liberia was not produced by the ACS. It was not produced by the white man. Liberia is the product of a very complex set of relationships that have been in the development, in the making over several centuries on the African continent, in West Africa, and in the larger Atlantic world. What's that Atlantic world? That's stretching to Europe, that's stretching to the Americas, North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Liberia is intimately tied, the people of Liberia, intimately tied up with that modern world that took them several centuries to come into existence, starting from the 15th century. And so beginning in the late 18th century, and for like about half of 30, 40, 50 years after the Haitian, French, American revolutions, there's this movement towards the abolition of slavery. And that movement towards the abolition of slavery isn't limited to specific countries. It's global. It's Atlantic-wide. It includes African people who play a major central role in that whole process of breaking down that system of slavery, which had been under construction for 200-300 years, and of which, of course, the people who would become Liberians are right inside there. They're the participants in that process through those centuries, etc. And so that very complex story is where we start. One of the things I'll just throw out there for now is that one of the peculiarities, one of the things that sets Liberia apart and what becomes Liberia, that space, one of the peculiarities is that the people who populate that area are in a struggle with forces who would like to join up and be part of the extension of this system, of this transatlantic system of capitalism that is emerging, this new merchant capitalism that's based on the enslavement of African people. And there are African people who are resisting it. And so that the peopling of Liberia is connected to that resistance, actually, of that system that's expanding. Now, that is taking place side by side with other Africans who are collaborating with and partners in partnership with this expansion of capitalism by Europeans. And I don't think really that Africans today, Liberians today, should be surprised, shocked, or like that should be weird or strange to them, because in our own lifetimes, we see Africans who collaborate with people who don't have African people or Liberian people interests. A global capitalist system that's still around here. And we got Africans who sell out their own people, right? That's happening in our own faces. And we know that those things produce conflicts. And then there are people who are like fighting for justice and fighting for equality. So our people have been fighting for justice and equality for a very long time. And they were doing those things. My point is that they were doing those things before 1822. But let me slow that down.
That is clear. Even you appear here a couple of times talking about Liberian history before that 1822. So, and these complex things that were happening at that time. For the sake of the discussion, we want to put that marker at the time that the ex-slaves are leaving America, going to Liberia. What is giving rise to that? And you already said that the ACS play a key role, but not even major. So let's begin from those things that were happening and why Liberians or people we know today as Liberians had to leave. What happened? Who played that role?
The ACS is it's a strange animal. It is an unlikely alliance amongst different sets of people in the United States. It includes slave owners, plantation owners, the plantation class. But to say that doesn't even mean that the ACS is strictly speaking a representative of the plantation class, even though it has these elements that are major drivers of it. For example, the most famous American of his time is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a slave owner. We know that's how he got his wealth, and he's a defender of it. But Thomas Jefferson, despite the fact that he's invited to join the ACS, never joins it. He refuses to join it. He has his own opposition to it for his own reasons, although, and this shows the complexity of this issue, Jefferson had been one of the first to call for, his word, the expulsion of Black people from the United States. That was Jefferson's, he was kind of proposing that in the 1780s. If liberation and emancipation were to take place, he would call for that if they were expelled from the country. But Jefferson, but when an organization for that purpose, or when people gathered to see if they could pursue that purpose, Jefferson says, no, I want nothing to do with this. He had other ideas, and for him too, people could be sent to South America. In fact, there are many other efforts over the years by Black people in the United States and white people in the United States for Blacks to be settled somewhere. Some Black people go to Canada. They're going for freedom. After 1830s, I should say, Canada has slavery before that. Some go to Haiti. Some of them go to Haiti.
You're saying that the ACA came together for the expulsion of Black people from the United States. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the ACS is a strange animal. I'm saying that it's like a marriage of convenience. I'm saying that it is an alliance of different sorts of people who have different agendas. The wealthiest people in the ACS are the plantation owners. They are these people like Henry Clay. I'm using names, Clay Ashland. I'm using names that are famous. People know them. He was the Speaker of the House of the United States, ran for president several times, etc. Those people like Henry Clay is an unvarnished. In other words, he's like he is a virulent. His racism is, he doesn't hide it. Other people are cooler than that. They're smarter than that, or smoother than that. Henry Clay sees Black people as vicious. Those are some of his words. As a terrible kind of and specifically Black people who are free. As vicious people and shouldn't be in the United States. So people like him and who reflect that kind of group, yeah, they could have had those objectives in joining it in with the ACS. The ACS, on the other hand, also had whites who were well-meaning. Robert Findlay, the man who actually is the big person carrying this process. He's an anti-slavery man. He's against slavery. And he has this idea, many people might call him an idealist, of Christianity going to Africa. Although Christianity had been in Africa before it got to Europe, but Robert Findlay isn't interested in that part of the history. Robert Findlay is thinking about the problems in the United States. Well, he's like, okay, maybe our goals could meet here. There's some commonality here. I'm looking for a way that Africans could. Black people could go to Africa, and these guys have money, and more importantly, they have political influence, and so maybe they can finance what I want to do. So that's what Findlay is trying to do, and Findlay goes around to Black communities, free Black communities in the United States, trying to convince them. Now let me stop there for a moment and fill up a little bit more for you for context here. Liberia was not founded by freed slaves. Let me repeat that. Liberia was not founded by freed slaves. It was founded by free Black people. And people, and meaning that first vanguard, and people like, what's the difference, those are important differences if you think of the context in which these people are removed. The American Colonization Society's official name was actually the Society for the Colonization of Free People. So not every.
I don't get when you say the colonization of free people.
People of African descent, yeah, of African descent.
Why do you want to colonize them?
But no. Even before you get to the colonized part, let's go to the free part.
Okay.
Most people seem to think of slavery in simply binary terms. People were either enslaved or they were free, and people were Black and enslaved and white and free. But there was a substantial, and by substantial I mean tens of thousands of Black people who were free in the United States, as in born free, meaning to be the children of Black people who were also free. Beginning in the 1770s, that's 50 years before they come to Liberia, 50 years before they come to Africa. Beginning in the 1770s, thousands of African Americans gained their freedom. They gained their freedom through a variety of ways, one of which is they fight the war, and they're veterans, and they gain their freedom that way. Some of them, the laws are loosened, and some of them, and made easier for them. And so many of them buy their freedom from their masters. The masters allowed them, kind of agreed to that in the context, again, of the revolution, the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. So that by 1820, there are about 60,000 of free African Americans in the United States already. And
can you clarify something, please? Are you saying that within the context of those folks who were Blacks, who were free, that freedom basically had not had different meaning, but there were many ways through which someone was free?
yeah,
And the assortment of those type of ways were free possibly makes up the movement to the ACS. So you have different Blacks from different ways from which they were free coming in to this ACS.
So I'm laying the groundwork for explaining the relationship of the free Blacks to the ACS, right? So first you have to realize that they're again, compared to the Black population in the United States, it's small, it's 5%. But nonetheless, it's a large population. It's thousands of them. And these free Blacks, when the revolution ends and the War of Independence ends, they buy property. They form the first people who formed the Black churches in the United States are free Blacks. The people who formed the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the people who formed the African Baptist Church, the first African Baptist Church of Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina. These are free Black people. They actually, some of them, they're able to buy property. What do? They're tradespeople, right? Carpenters, masons. They are small traders, market people, right? They sell wares in the markets, shop people. Those sorts of, they create the Black Masonry, Masonic tradition. They created those schools for themselves. There's a whole variety of things. So there's this small but important free Black population in the United States. Most of them live in Virginia and Maryland, in the Chesapeake area. Fewer of them are in the Northeast, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, those cities, especially Philadelphia. And then you have others in deeper further down, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, right? And the dynamics of those free Black societies are also different. And so these various societies, they're doing these things in common. And one of the themes amongst them is this notion of their freedom. How do they consolidate that freedom that they had won? And so they're constantly in conflict with the plantation owners, with Thomas Jefferson and people like those in the various states. They're constantly, because although the American Revolution, this is one of the great contradictions of the American Revolution, although it opened the gates, and as I just said, many African people are able to gain their freedom in the 1770s and 80s, that gate was quickly closed at the end of the revolution. Once the plantation owners, the slave owners, had won power and consolidated the power, they tried to roll back the gains that the Africans had made and started to deny opportunities to them. They started to deny, basically exclude them from, the promise and the possibilities of this American citizenship. So they're denied citizenship on the basis of their African ancestry. And so those people are reacting and responding in a whole variety of ways. One of which for them is, well, maybe we are African people, and what would be best is for us to reconnect with Africa. When the African Americans, the African diaspora gets to Liberia, or what becomes Liberia in 1822, they're not the first to talk about Africa and want to go back. And they're not the first to see themselves as Africans and to try to go somewhere. They've been doing that for quite a while. There's a man called Daniel Coker from Baltimore, Maryland, African American, who was the leader of the very first trip on that ship called Elizabeth that left New York and went to Sherbrooke, or went to Freetown. And then some of the people who sort of remained and eventually would go to Cape Mesurado. Daniel Coker in 1809 wrote a pamphlet about his African identity. And he's making references to people talking about West Africa. He's already in his own mind starting to think about this idea, you know. So there's Coker. There's a man called Paul Coffey, who is actually he's a fairly well-to-do by the standards of his own time, African American man. There, his father actually was born that name Coffey. His father was born, we assume, from what today would be Ghana. Because he uses that. That's the name he carries with himself. He's a ship captain. He owns ships. He uses his own money to finance 2 trips of free Black people from the United States to Sierra Leone. All of this is happening before 1820, right? It's very, very important for Liberians to understand that part of the history.
It's important, Dr. Brewer, because you're saying people are voluntarily repatriating.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And Coffey has a very expansive set of views about the relationship that he thinks Blacks in the United States should have with Blacks in Africa. Coffey wants to establish on a regular basis a system of trade links, you know, Black businesses. Because for Coffey, the United States is a racist society. Blacks are being excluded and they're not going to have any opportunities or chances. So if they could connect up with their African brothers, that's how Coffey is thinking, on the west coast of Africa, they can start to find ways to develop their economic independence, you know, that sort of thing. And then you can also, Coffey has several agendas, also by that token, proselytize. He's a Quaker, he's not a Baptist or Methodist, but you can take Christianity, you can introduce, that's him thinking, you know, those sorts of things. But the bigger point I'm making though is that in those free Black communities, they know about Africa, they know what Africa means, etc. Because again, they're not calling the church the Methodist Episcopal Church, they're calling it the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Nobody put a gun to their heads and says, call the church African. No, they saw themselves as African people. The church in Richmond is called the African Baptist. You know, the church in Savannah is the African Baptist. They saw themselves, they call their schools the African institution, right? And on and on and on. African consciousness exists amongst free Black people. And if we went even further, and scholars have done a lot of studies about that, the retentions and the sort of identification of Africa amongst that free Black population, including some of those folks who would end up returning onto Cape Mesurado.
All right. So basically, specifically for Liberia, what took them there? Is it because they were being expelled? Because these are the school of thought that we've heard. They've been expelled because the whites don't want them to live here, or they themselves have to go. So what specifically?
So it's complicated. It's complicated. It's not an easy or simplistic answer. There are people who, and there's a division that emerges amongst the free Black population. When people like Coffey, so remember now, Coffey, because remember again, I just said, most Black people, most African people in this country are enslaved. Then there's this 10% who are free. The 10% who are free live tough lives, very constricted, and there's a lot of laws against them. There's all these fugitive slave laws, for example, what's the fugitive slave law? The American Constitution, when they were organizing themselves, part of their sort of whole arrangement was, you know, the benefit of the doubt is always to the slaveholder. The slaveholders demanded that they have the authority to snatch any Black person who ran away for their freedom and bring them back. And that if you, a white person, for example, were found helping them, you, the white person, got into trouble too, you're breaking the law. So the fugitive slave law is an incredibly important and powerful tool used by the plantation owners to both consolidate their power, but also to oppress the Black population. And so for free Blacks, that was always hanging over their heads. So they have that consciousness. We need to break out of this place. And so the idea of returning, the return, you know, Africa's homeland is a big idea. And so Coffey, to see Coffey promoting that idea is not surprising. Coffey's popular Coffee is rare in the sense that he's able to gain some income and earning for himself. He's well known, he's respected, right? And he's this person who is like consciously, associated with that African connection.
Mm.
Reverend Finley, who I mentioned much earlier, this sort of well-intentioned white priest, Presbyterian minister, who wants to take Christianity to Africa. He hears about coffee. He goes and he meets coffee, and then he is saying to coffee, look, I'd like to get involved in this. I'm interested in this. Let's see if we can work together. But coffee dies. And when coffee dies, Finley had not only been speaking to coffee, he had also been speaking to some of these, because he's looking for money. He knows that it costs money. He's also been speaking to some of these powerful plantation owners. And the people who were close allies and friends of coffee, who had actually helped coffee, there's a man called James Forten, Forten, from Philadelphia, African-American. He's probably wealthier than coffee. He used to manufacture sail. What are sails? Sails are the big white sail sheets that you use on boats. And in those days before machines, right, before steamboat and all that stuff, that's how those ships sailed the Atlantic with sails, these massive sails. And Forten, that's what he made. He made it in Philadelphia, and he became wealthy from that. Forten is practically coffee's best friend. And Forten is completely behind coffee. Yes, let's organize business, because so think about it. These are two black businessmen, and they want to do business in Africa, and they want to sort of like develop this sort of independent kind of business connection and foundation.
Mm.
But once coffee dies, and then Forten sees that the ACS has been founded, and who's founding it? Forten says, not me. He invites, there's a very, very important meeting that takes place in Philadelphia, right after the ACS meeting, after that ACS was founded. And they bring the priests to go talk to the black people there in Philadelphia, all free people there, And if people are like, hell to the no, as my students, like, no, we ain't going nowhere, because look at who you hanging out with, Mr. Finley. Are you crazy? No. We see you right away. We know you by your friends, the company you keep. We're not going to be fooled. And Forten is writing, he's writing his letters, his notes about the meeting. He says, like, I just sort of said, let me not say anything here before these people get on my case. I'm out. These people being the black masses, before they get on my case. I'm not going to go.
I got a question there. Mm-hmm. So basically, are you saying that, or maybe what the issue is, I don't know if it's necessarily the issue, but there was a desire to transition to do trade with Africa. That was one set. But as they were going along that trajectory, depending on who the leadership was, some folks decided to maybe side with the different leadership based on their life philosophy.
So yes, and this is not a matter that is settled right away. Right. It goes for decades, because I've just given you an example of somebody who was, yes, let's go to Africa, and somebody who, and then he switched from let's go to Africa to no, I'll stay here. Those people there those people, meaning the white people who are saying that they will help us. I don't trust those people, and I'm not going to have anything to do with them. There's a case of another person who, famous, John Russwurm, more Liberians should know about him, who is adamantly against going to Africa. And who's Russwurm? Russwurm, among many things, established the first black newspaper in this country. Freedom's Journal was his name. And Russwurm, in the pages of his newspaper is like, no, this is a trick. These white plantation owners and others racists, they just want to get rid of free people like us, free black people like us, because we're preaching for freedom, and we're trying to serve as examples. We're undermining their authority and those sorts of things, and they want nothing to do with us.
But it wasn't because necessary there was a hatred or there was a disdain for Africa. It was just more so for the fact that there was a longing or belonging to the American soil. It wasn't because there was any, I guess you can say, animosity with some of the various groups like Fortin had or some of the other colonization societies. It was just simply because of his philosophical belief that they've put in too much work here on the soil.
So the idea of, again, there are different positions, again,
Right.
I'm saying, and not only are there different positions, but people also change their view. So Russwurm, who I'm speaking of, he changed his view. And he came to the conclusion, because these debates, if you read the pages, for example, of Freedom Journal, they start to debate. And Russwurm changes his view about staying in the United States and discouraging people from going to Liberia, and becomes a proponent of it. In fact, he leaves and he goes to Liberia. And Russwurm actually is governor of Maryland in Africa. And those are, in fact, he's also the founder of the Liberian Herald, the first Liberian newspaper as well. So again, so you see where my point is that you see where Fortin goes from being against, going to Africa, and then he becomes against it. He's for it, and he's against it. Russwurm is against it, and it becomes for it. I'm saying this is fluid. The situation is fluid. People are changing their minds about these things because it's like they're trying to understand where they fit in the United States, in the larger context of the world that is happening, existing at that time. Because if you read them, all of them are assessing, where do Black people fit? Where do we belong? Right. What are our best options, really? Where can we succeed? Those are like real live problems they're dealing with and trying to solve. Mm-hmm. So the people who end up then going to Liberia are part of this larger argument that is taking place among Black people. And it's not only in the United States or amongst people who go to Liberia who are having these discussions. In Brazil, the free Black people are having the very same discussion. Right? Throughout the Caribbean, they're having that discussion. And in fact, the people who go to Liberia are just part of a larger movement of African people from the diaspora back to their homelands. Lagos City, lots of people don't know, Lagos City is formed by Black people from Brazil. Right? They go different cities in Cotonou, Porto Novo, etc. These places in today, Benin and Togo. Black people from the diaspora who go back to those places. Freetown, obviously, the most obvious one, as one of the earlier ones, consists of people who were in the diaspora who go back. So in that regard, there's nothing peculiar about the Africans in the diaspora who leave the Chesapeake, etc., leave North America and return in that regard.
Let me introduce.
They're part of a larger pattern.
I want us to come to James Monroe, but before that, you just mentioned Lagos, Freetown, and we have Monrovia, where people from the diaspora are going, Black people, and settling there. The only peculiar thing is for Liberia, those people became known as Americo-Liberians. That is, what was different when it comes to those who settled in Freetown, Lagos? What was different about those in Liberia that they still wanted to carry the American identity?
Yeah, no, it's not different. In Benin, they still call them the name who their families who want to be called, and they call them. And you look at the names of the Beninois people of Benin, they still have many of them still have the. I'm blanking on the name of the man who was even president of Benin, Olympio, right? They have Olympio. That's not an African name.
Right.
And the no. So what I'm saying is, or the Olympio family. And in Lagos and those places. So in Freetown for sure, they talk about the Creole, right? So those names come there. And my point simply is that I can and would love to talk about specifically the Americo-Liberian identity, but I'm just making a point that it's part of a pattern, longer pattern. They're not, again, the Americo-Liberians are not unique. That's all. No big. They're part of something larger as well.
Let's introduce James Monroe and the role he played in the repatriation of the Blacks to what we know today as Liberia. Who's he?
Monroe is a planter, a slave plantation owner. He's part of the plantation class who founds the state, the this North American state. And again, you want to really understand Monroe, you have to kind of basically understand the development of capitalism in Virginia in the 18th century, you know, and how this particular class emerges in Virginia. I mean, historians kind of argue, you know, about the specific time periods and which particular groups make it, but there's a general understanding and consensus, you know, that there's a what they call a plantation revolution that takes place about 100 years before that in Virginia and in Maryland, where tobacco becomes the product, the commodity, the export commodity par excellence that shapes and determines the developments of colonial America. And that is based on the model that the European capitalism had developed in the Caribbean and South America with sugar, that you're able to bring that model, transfer that model here into North America. And that allowed for the expansion and development of American capitalism. The United States is based on, like the rest of these, I talked about the Atlantic world, like the rest of these economies, you know, it's African labor, you know, enslaved African labor on land that was expropriated from the native populations, right, indigenous populations of the area, and finding a crop, a commercial crop for export. That was the model that was used. And so Virginia is very much right within that. And Monroe's class, including Madison and Jefferson, Washington, all of those people on the dollar bills and the first sets of presidents of the United States, all of them, right, benefit. Well, there's the exception of the Adams from Massachusetts, but all of them, Andrew Jackson, all of them come out of that process, and they established their state, right, with the intention of solidifying, consolidating, you know, the rule of capital and property, really, and this the kind of private property, including property in human beings. The American Constitution, you know, is the original American Constitution, right? It's a large statement about capitalism and property, and the rights of property. It's the foundational, you know, text, it's the foundational basis of this country. The property rights actually take precedence over individual rights. They do. Nobody can tell me that they don't. They do. That's why the people fought the Civil War over that issue again. You know, and just the other day, the Supreme Court is saying, yeah, corporations are people, didn't it? Everybody knows that. And we're talking about the fundamentals of the United States, right? And the laws are there to protect property. And what is property? And the Southerners, the plantation slave owners, are saying, it's ownership. That's what's fundamental here. So Monroe then therefore is run of the mill. There's nothing special about him. There's nothing about him that makes him stand out. I'm saying that he's a garden variety slave owner. That's what I'm saying, right? Who benefits from the fact of how a birth he inherited. You know, a birth, he benefits from that. He marries more money, you know, so they can consolidate their property. He owns human beings. There's nothing special about Monroe. As an American president, there's really nothing special about him, and it's reflected even within the context or terms of how American history and politics, etc., measures its leaderships and its own originators. Monroe is not given the prominence that Madison is given. He's not given the prominence that Jefferson is given. He's not given the prominence that Washington is given. I mean, think about it. You know, there are a whole lot more things named after Washington, Jefferson, Madison than Monroe. Right. You know, so a whole lot more Jefferson counties, etc., in this country. He's nowhere on no dollar bill. There's no memorial to him in Washington, D.C. or in Richmond. I mean, we can go on and on and on. I'm just saying that he's not a big deal. And he was a party hack in many ways too, of the Democratic Republican Party. He was the dominant political characters even during his era, his time, were people like Henry Clay, you know, and John Quincy Adams. And those are the people who were like those movers and shakers. I mean, he was skillful again as a kind of party hack man. He kind of made his money there. But Monroe himself, he was no thinker. You know, Madison was a thinker. Jefferson, you know, the ideologists, etc., of their party and their class. He was no great sort of thinker. Monroe's other legacy, Liberians, I don't know what, is the Monroe, so-called Monroe Doctrine, which, I mean, he didn't write it, but it's under his name, in which the United States is asserting its right to control the rest of the Americas, the Monroe Doctrine, and they've used that as as their justification for imperialism and conquest, the United States, that is, throughout the Americas, that Monroe Doctrine. So Monroe is an unapologetic slave owner. He's an unapologetic imperialist. Those guys.
So what role did he play in the resettlement of the free blacks? And what was the general conversation going on? What was the discussion going on in Congress and other places regarding people going back to Liberia?
So Monroe himself is not a member of the ACS. I've seen people, he's not a member of the ACS, and doesn't need to be either. So he's president of the United States. And as I said to you folks before, let me repeat it again, Jefferson is against the ACS, right? There are other plantation and slave owners who are against the ACS. These things are complex. And so there's no consensus here about what to do with the Negro problem, what to do with the black problem, what to do with the free black problem. That's the issue for them, right? And so they're negotiating, they're maneuvering, they're saying all kinds of things. Take this word, I'll put that word in. And the United States had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1809, right? The United States had outlawed it. Monroe comes to power. With a law, you can pass all kinds of laws if you want, but you need to be able to implement the passing of the law. Now we can discuss, and that's why I say context is everything. We can discuss why the United States outlawed the slave trade. And let me explain very quickly for you. It outlawed it because the black population of the country was naturally self-reproducing. In other words, the United States did not need to dip into the market on black bodies anymore because its own black population was naturally reproducing, right? It was replacing itself. Black women were having more than two children on average, right? So that cost went out of the window for them, and it's an economic thing, right? Let's not kid ourselves what's going on here. And so they could afford then to say, hey, play and take. I would argue, take the moral high ground as well. We're against this stuff, but really and truly, it's an economic. They have an economic benefit as well. That's leading that. That's the economic choice and the calculation that's going on there. So they need to be able to enforce it, and they have been fiddling around with this issue for a while about enforcing the ban on the transatlantic slave trade. How can you have, first of all, only the United States and Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade. Spain and France and Portugal continued the trade. They continued doing it. So then the problem becomes, well, if Spain and France and Portugal, for their own reasons, are continuing this, what do we do to stop it from happening? Especially that, again, Britain is on board now to say, yeah, we're going to enforce it. There's Freetown. We're going to start to send naval ships there. The naval ships can intercept slave ships. And as the British naval ships intercept slave ships, they take the so-called cargo, black people who are captured on the ships, put them in Freetown and release them there. That's the British idea. The British are doing it. The British would like us to think that they're doing it for strictly humanitarian reasons, right? That's what they'd like us to think. When I talk to students oftentimes, I tell people, don't see parallels. Things are not exactly the same, but see parallels if you can. Today, the language of humanitarian assistance is a word that y'all hear it all the time. Humanitarian assistance. And you ask yourself, is it really humanitarian assistance? Is it only humanitarian assistance? Right there in Liberia itself, the United Nations spent a lot of money. Plenty of people went to Liberia for humanitarian assistance. Tell me, what was the record of the United Nations in Liberia, right? There are all kinds of sides to that particular story.
Right. We normally blame ourselves for not using the money wisely.
So humanitarian assistance. So the United States is getting into this humanitarian assistance game as well, right? It also, so even if that might have been part of it, we know for sure as well that there are other objectives, like making the United States a larger naval power,
Like what?
feeling its oats, etc., developing its navy, doing things like those. So all of those are the kinds of debates and discussions going on in Congress about why they should set up a station where the ships can get water, right, or refuel, we like about get water, and those sorts of things. The squadron that it would set up that would go and ply the waters. And so that's the kind of logic that they're using. And indeed, when you read the bill in which the money is allocated for setting up this station, that's what they're saying. They're saying nothing about set up a country. That's not the objective. They're saying nothing at all about, getting rid of free blacks from the country. None of that stuff. The bill is just strictly, we want $150,000 allocated to set up a station. That we need workers to go to that station to be the personnel, right? To be the staff, to staff it. And Americans, naval ships who applied West Africa from time to time to catch these ships doing this illegal business. They would take the people and they would put them down there. That was that was how it was explained and organized, and that's the basis upon which Monroe is able to assist the ACS people, right, in giving them money. But I would argue that as important as that was, because the ACS never at any point in time came anywhere close to being able to finance that operation at all. What was actually very important was the presence of the United States naval ships. That's critical. The presence of the U.S. Navy ships.
But you were saying that was not for
that was
humanitarian
important.
reason that they were
Sorry?
doing it. You were
Not for
saying-
humanitarian reasons.
Yeah,
I'm saying that they would state officially for humanitarian reasons,
right.
but it's more than just humanitarian. There's more in the mortar than the pestle, as you say, and so we're putting out the pestle now. We're kind of the other things that are inside that mortar.
I can't wait to hear that.
So they go there.
No, I say I can't wait to hear what's under the pencil.
Yes, I mean, what are those things there? And those things become, the little business, little parts about the Fugitive Slave Law, the various arguments over slavery in the United States, because Congress every few years has to come back to this question of how, does slavery expand or not, and so every time there's some sort of compromise or other. I'm sure again, for the people who have just a basic knowledge of this history, the Missouri Compromise, there's always some compromise. They're discussing this issue of slavery. As the United States encroaches more and more on Indian land, Native American land, these things become new states. So when the new state comes in, does the new state come in as a state where slavery is admitted, allowed, or not, right? And then they come to some compromise. And so all of those, that's at a particular time, all of those things are happening simultaneously, and they inform and influence each other, right? So the argument becomes, hey, look, here's one way to as a compromise to relieve the pressure. Those people who are against slavery, you can say to them, hey, look, here's a middle ground. One group of the abolitionists, the people who want to abolish slavery, are saying, free all the people now. And then the other side of the argument is, no, we're not going to do it. And then these guys are like, okay, you know what? Here's a middle ground. You can free them, but let them go. Kind of combination. And so that argument now crawls into the mission of the ACS, which had been started discussing simply free Black people. And now all of a sudden, it starts talking about, well, free people are enslaved, they get free, and then we will send them. But notice what has just happened here. When that boat that left New York in February or whatever of winter of 1820, that boat that left New York, no former slave is on that boat, none. All these people are free people. The vast majority of them born free, actually, right? But they're all free and had lived in, and even if they were enslaved at birth, they got free early enough and had lived in this country as free people, up until the point that they got on that ship, and they're on that ship and they're going. Mostly, actually, children are the majority of people on that first group, right? Women, female, are the majority as well. And so if you look at the passenger list itself, who those people are, where they came from, what they had been doing here before they left. It includes people like, what's his name, Elijah Johnson, who actually fought in the War of 1812 and had been a veteran of that particular war. It includes a whole bunch of different folks who are there. Small, who have been a carpenter in Philadelphia. It's a bunch of different folks who are there. And then they're followed by others who, again, are kind of, the Nautilus is the other ship that goes to Cherbourg shortly after that. And the Nautilus that's the ship that has Lakeri on it. And for Liberians, Lakeri is a school, Lakeri Baptist, and it's like just done. But that's an interesting history with those people. You look at the Tejas, you look at people like, name will come back to me in a minute, but you look at these families. These are people who, Colin Teej, this is Hillary Teej's father. These are people who are in Richmond. They're they're part of that free black community. Teej is a saddler. Lakeri works in the tobacco warehouse as a manager or something like that. These are people who operate within that free black community, having purchased, they have some standing. They have plenty standing within their free black communities, but within the larger context of a racist society, no, they're not. And those people had created in Richmond a group called the Richmond African Baptist Society, Missionary Society, with the purpose of financing and funding missionaries. This is all black people, black missionaries who would go. Those are the same people who created the Providence Baptist Church in Richmond before they go to Sherwood. Right? The Providence Baptist Church was organized, a congregation here, right? With all of those ideas in their heads before. There's this famous quote of Lakeri, and someone asked him, why are you doing this? But he says, I'm an African. And in this country, African people are not respected, so I'm going home. I mean, he was like straight up. Right? That was his.
So James Monroe secured this 150,000 for a station to be established, not a country. And they get there in Liberia. And according to what we hear is they wanted to be grateful for James Monroe, and that's why they named the capital city after James Monroe.
So who named the capital?
When they arrived there, before they arrived at that decision.
The argument around the naming of Monrovia is really an argument about Liberian identity. That's what that argument really is, right? What is the nature of the Liberian national identity? That whole argument about the naming of the city got nothing to do with, or what were the facts? What difference does it make if the government of Liberia, as it was constituted, because it's a colony anyway, at that time were the ones who made the decision. And they were not. This was the decision that was made here in the United States. It was not a decision, meaning the Monrovia decision. It was not a decision that was made there. Right? The folks there had their own ideas.
The decision to name Monrovia after James Monroe was made in the United States.
Of course. It was made
by whom?
By the ACS. By the ACS.
Okay.
Obviously, it's the ACS. And why are the ACS doing it? They're doing it for the same reasons that people named Washington National Airport Ronald Reagan National Airport. There are a bunch of political. I don't want to be harsh and say hacks, but they believe in this sort of business of idolizing and putting up on a pedestal, their political leaderships and those sorts of things. Making him feel good about it. The same reason Liberian people went and changed their name and called it Tubmanburg, and you can go on, and Tubman's name is all over the place. I mean, it's his supporters and that sort of thing. Oh, yeah, we think you're a great man. Those are the kinds of things that are going
So this discussion does not even go on in among the free blacks. This is an ACS thing.
The people had different ideas. Yes, some of them say we call it Christopolis, but I mean, what did that mean? In the sense that people have this discussion as if there's this functioning system that's already in place, and we're going to have a debate in Parliament, and then we're going to do this. No, there's a lot of improvisation that's going on. People are doing things as they move along, right? And then later on, they turn back and say, by the way, we'll do this, we'll do that. Or we can do this, we can't do that. I think that again, and let's again widen this lens a little bit more. As I said before to you, this argument that people are having today, which is fine, is an argument about Liberian national identity. That really is the argument people are having today. And what it reflects, what it means, what it symbolizes, that's the argument about the whole business about Monrovia. If you go back to the time and place, the context is different. There's really no Liberia. There's a tiny little settlement that is developing and emerging. On top of what had long been an important staging area of the transatlantic slave trade. Right. So that's that context. And so the kinds of ways and the importance that the weight we give to our arguments, that they are quite different from what people would have been doing back then. Back to the American Navy, please, the US Navy. The US Navy shifts the balance of power in that region. The presence of the US Navy shifts the balance of power in that region. And with the coming of the US Navy in many ways again, it made people recalculate things, the people who are there on the ground. That's really what I like. The people who are there on the ground, they have to recalculate, what are the balance of forces here? Do I go against these people? Do I kind of make alliances? Right? These are the kinds of issues that they have to have a discussion about. Mm-hmm. The folks who are laying claim to some sovereignty over that little space, I mean Cape Mesurado, right? And so and also there's not, just as how there is no consensus or homogeneous way of looking at them here, there's no consensus or homogeneous way of looking at them over there either. In Ducor. In Ducor, they're rivals. There are different forces there in Ducor. And so now they have to sort of sit down and figure out to themselves, what happens with these guys coming here? Yeah? And how does this change things? And of course, if we look at the 1820s and the 1830s, very crucial, what plays out in the 1820s and 1830s, we see these alliances starting to shift. And an important figure who emerges is Salbozo Camara, right? Who actually changes sides and comes to kind of, for him, an important strategic decision that he's making. Maintaining power and influence, means forging a new kind of relationship with these people, with those Africans who are these Black people who are now emerging here with the United States, with the United States Navy, because the presence of the United States Navy, and importantly, the flag of the United States, which is representing that Navy. I mean, folks, let us not be abstract. Think about your slave ship. You're plying the waters of the Atlantic world. You know who has power and who doesn't have power in the Atlantic world. You know the different flags and what they represent. You're a Spanish slave ship, you're a Portuguese slave ship or a French slave ship, and you see the American flag flying over there. What you gonna do? What does that immediately tell you as well? Of course, it tells you that the Americans are now there. Yeah. Your attitude is gonna change. The way you look at that issue is kind of gonna change. And while you might have gone there, that's where that American flag is flying up there, you go further down the coast. And we kind of will see through the 1820s, 1830s, a lot of these skirmishes and frankly, outright sometimes it's shooting hostilities between these Spanish, for the most part, Spanish, French, Portuguese slave traders, and those Liberian authorities, or those emerging, I should say, Liberian authorities.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Focus on Liberia, and you are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. We are discussing the history around the name or renaming of Monrovia. Our phone lines are posted so that you can call. But Dr. Brewer, complete your thoughts so I can read some comments.
No, I was just saying that, in our time, there used to be this famous phrase about the American nuclear umbrella. And folks use that phrase to say that, during the Cold War, certain countries lined up with the United States and they sought the protection of the American nuclear umbrella. And in this inter-imperial kind of rivalry that's going on. And in many ways, this umbrella is what because again, we talk about U.S. strategic military interest in that part. This umbrella is what these people who are here now, they see the relevance and the usefulness of that umbrella. If you are on the ground and you happen to be, it's not everybody, but it's one or two of these guys. If you happen to be an ally, a business partner of a European trader, slave trader, if you're an African business partner of the European slave trader, and these folks come with their American gunship flag, you are not just simply going to, you're looking at what are the potential outcomes of conflict. Just leave it there. What are the potential outcomes of conflict? And you act accordingly. Basically, how do you operate? How do you attack, knowing fully well that they're coming back? Let me just sort of finish that part. Most of the money that the ACS, in terms of that people look at $150,000, most of the money was military, and not just and that sending of U.S. naval ships and sending of weapons, etc. Those things are not under the 150,000, but most of that stuff is military, where they're sending munitions, they're sending cannon, they're sending all of those things there, and those are like big guns. Those are not. As I said, it shifted the balance of power in the region. Completely shifted the balance of power. Nobody else had cannon. These guys have cannon.
Dr. Herbert, well, something interesting though is that looking at these things that are happening with the shipment of these, is this while President Monroe is still in the office, or this is where he has stepped away from the office? Because the assumption here or so forth is that if you're dealing or if you're trading arms or you're buying arms and so forth, maybe I'm missing the context, but it seems as if the purchasing of arms would be restricted. Not anybody can just go and buy it. So what was that role in terms of some of that might that enable those early settlers and so forth to maintain or to stand their ground? Because those were some heavy machinery.
They're not buying that arms. I mean, those arms, those are arms that are given to them. ACS, and the ACS is being supplied by the United States government. Which is,
I'm guessing at that time, President Monroe, he's not in the White House as the head of state, right?
He's only there for 4 years, for 1820 to 1824, meaning because like they set themselves up in 22. Yeah, so he's really only there for 2 years.
Yeah, but those are very influential years. I mean, you're looking at someone who has the influence of the president from maybe 1816 to 1824. I mean,
y'all focus too much on the president.
No, I'm not
symbolic.
No. I said you're looking at someone who has the influence of the governance that enables the ACS or whoever to procure weapons. That's, because you're talking about,
and you want to know who has that influence?
Like, we are trying to look and say, is it that someone like James Monroe, because the ACS had his support?
But James Monroe, the strength of the ACS, if you like,
yes,
comes from the Virginia congressmen. It comes from those figures, that faction. It is really Virginians, it really is Virginians.
But does that include James Monroe?
Sorry?
Does that include James Monroe?
Yes, but again, Monroe is what I'm trying to get you guys at is like, let's leave Monroe, but you're talking about Monroe, but it's not.
Because the whole topic, we're trying to find out, right? We're looking at this and saying that, hey, why or what would drive or what would move the folks in power to want to name the capital per se after this guy, when in actuality, so we're trying to figure out that context through how symbolic it was.
Who are the folks in power?
Where, in Liberia or in the U.S.?
So, okay, so I'm saying in both places. So I'm saying to you
Uh-huh.
that the folks in the black people
Yeah.
are not the ones who give the place the name. They're not. That we know that for a fact because it is documented as a fact.
Okay,
You know?
pause, because you're just saying something very important here.
Yeah, it's documented as a fact. The black people in Liberia are not the ones who give it the name. The ACS sends them communications, and in the communications, it writes there specifically, this is the name, this is the new name we've decided upon that we're going to give the town.
Monrovia.
Yes.
Okay, so basically what you're bringing up is something that maybe have been in the history books, but it's something that we want to maybe talk about a little bit more, right? Because the assumption or from our previous discussions on the shows and from our previous folks who have been on the show, it's the idea that the Americo-Liberian looked at James Monroe and consider it an act of symbolic or an act of appreciation and say, hey, let's name this capital after James Monroe.
No, that is not what happened. Okay. So let me tell you, let me go a little bit
more now, because we've been along with that line, right? Now you're talking about there are documents that are saying a little bit otherwise. So please elaborate.
So the both Monrovia, the name Monrovia, and the name of the country Liberia, both those things are given to them by the ACS. Those are not names that the Liberians, that the black people give. Those are names given by the ACS, the American Colonization Society. Assigned those names. General Goodloe Harper, you want a name, who is a leading member of the American Colonization Society. He's also the man who Harper Kipalmas was named for, is the one who is credited by the other ACS people with having come up with the name or the names.
Okay.
Harper.
So
I'm just saying something here, but in any case, so not only am I saying to you that it's there in black and white in the actual manuscript in terms of the actual letter that they're writing or the communications that they're sending, but they go even further to say that this is actually the guy who comes up with hey, by the way, let's call it this and that. They're being that specific.
Well, I got to throw hot water in this one.
Sorry,
I got to throw a little bit of hot water in here. And say the guy who came up with this, was he black or was he white?
Oh, who, Harper? Harper's a white man.
Oh, okay. So
no, there's absolutely no one in the American Colonization Society who's black.
Okay.
Wow. Or I should say in the leadership. That's what we're talking about, basically.
Dennis,
right?
Thoughts?
No, I want to read some comments and then bring in our callers.
Okay.
Okay. So
very, very interesting.
Comments.
Interesting. And then go ahead, Dennis. Sorry.
Okay.
You have a lot of comments.
A lot of comments. I'm going, and somebody is saying, okay, you made a comment here too.
No, but go to the top because they were bombarding me. And
so, Mr. King, you look too serious. Are you in agreement with the discussion? That's from Bill Rogers. Emmanuel Wu said it was not the capital at that time. It was a settlement when it was named after Monroe. Boris Freeman said, Mr. Host, talking to me now, you are making the show boring. Please bring Mr. King into the discussion. James Lassa, and there was a time during the long and corrupt reign of Tubman when his supporters felt like changing the name of Monrovia to Tubmanburg. Can you imagine that of such a miserable field leader? Well, sounds familiar. Sounds like similar cries of today. Yeah, I don't know what's about Tubman. And good to know, Emmanuel Woods, that most of the money was spent on military logistics. Same thing today. All right. So let me bring in Mr. Jim Lassa. Also say, good question, William King. Emmanuel Woods, good question. Jim Lassa is also saying the minutes of the meeting deciding the naming of Monrovia is available and the reasons are stated there. Mr. Lassa, please share that if you can. The ACA was made of not only whites, but free and free black. For example, J.J. Roberts, a black man, was a lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth. So speak to that, Dr. Brewer, about J.J. Roberts being, part of the ACS, maybe a leader also.
I kind of, this thing is not really for whatever, the connections are not really that good. So but I think I heard some of the questions or comments that you were making there. So Joseph Jenkins Roberts was the governor of the Commonwealth, also the lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth. But again, I started very early discussing the ACS archives, and which is a store of information. But the ACS archives has a lot of silences in it. It has a lot of gaps in it. The ACS archives, they're interested in things from their perspective, from their point of view. And Liberians, if they want to construct a national history, as much as they will depend on what the ACS archives have, cannot simply regurgitate verbatim the perspective that the ACS has on Liberia. In fact, if you read those ACS guys, you'll hear them use phrases like "our colony." They own, as far as they were concerned, they owned it. Nothing would be further from the truth. A few months after the first set of people get onto Dazo Island, which we all know today as Providence Island, they're there for a short while, and they don't live there per se as really. I mean, they get on land. They're on land, and there are no white people there. I don't know that folks understand the importance of that fact. That Mr. Ayers, who was the official in charge, the white man that the ACS has sent as the agent, fled. He left. And the folks went and they hooked up with the Africans who are there. There is absolutely no way that the black people, the diaspora Africans, would have been able to survive on Adu and Aduko. No way they would have been able to survive without the assistance of Africans who were there. It is just impossible. And I ask you to think about that for a bit. They've never been to the place before, right? Where are they going to get water from? They've never been to the place before. Where are they going to get food from? They've never been to the place before. How are they, what are they going to build, etc. The people who come on initially, they are very few, not many of them. And in their own, in all the various different accounts that they're giving, right? And these are all complex things. Yes, there's a division amongst the Africans about to what extent do we accept them or not accept them.
Yeah,
and my point I'm making here is that they got assistance from some people, right? They don't meet unrelenting hostility. They do not meet that. They meet acceptance. And there are others who are saying, no, this thing, we haven't really clarified this issue amongst us here. There's a continuous palaver, if you like, that goes on at meetings and discussions that are taking place.
So why keep it? Why keep the name? Why keep the name if there's a lot of autonomous going on?
Okay, so
for about maybe 15 years to independence. So why would, for example?
It's an excellent question.
Why would they keep it?
It's an excellent question. So think about these few things here. So the diaspora is returning. They come there. They know some things. They don't know everything. They have to get to know. They know some of that environment. They're in some conflict. They're in some conversation. These things are simultaneous. while they have to while they get to know the law of the land. There is violence. We've been talking about the military thing. The larger context as well of that violence is that there is slave trading going on in West Africa, from Senegal to Angola. Liberia is absolutely not an exception to it, although the impact on Liberia is slightly different, because as I had said before, the people who live in Liberia are people who have found a refuge for themselves against this onslaught of European imperialism that had unleashed on West Africa, and that had really destroyed so many systems, societies in West Africa. And so there's this little corner, which we call today Liberia, in which people can find a semblance of a pause from that predatory behavior of the European system. So they're there, and that is actually what allows the Americans to go there. Let me put it to you another way: they couldn't stay in Sierra Leone, and they couldn't go to where Ivory Coast is and these other places. And the reason they couldn't do those things is because in those places, the formations that are there are not types that would have sort of had enough of a control to say, yeah, these people here, we can accept them. These people here, at the end of the day, can work with us to make this a zone of freedom. And that's what I'm trying to. That's the larger argument I'm making here. Those things allow that to happen. Now, that's one side of the story, because this is happening at different levels. There's several different things happening. We need to understand that complexity. For those people who are coming from the States and who are landing there, for them, as a practical matter, they need to establish for themselves. They've decided that they have to establish for themselves some sort of security for themselves. And the security that's on offer for them is that security that comes from the United States. That is the security that's on offer for them. So what is the price of that security? What is the price of that security? And if these people are saying to them, we'll call the place Liberia, they're like, sure, you can call it anything you want to call it. Okay, take it. You call the place, and then Liberia is a nice name. You call the place Monrovia, we'll call the place Monrovia. We'll call the place these things, we'll call the place those things. It's a compromise that's going on. I had started to say earlier that after they landed at the Cape, in a few months, people usually focus on little skirmishes and wars that will take place, between the people who come and some of the forces they meet there. There's a skirmish, there's a conflict that takes place between the repatriates and the American Colonization Society a few months after they arrive. When the repatriates write up a large, first of all, they chase Jehudi Ashman out of Monrovia. That's the first thing they do. And again, in our school systems, in the books written, et cetera, that part of the story is brushed aside. In the ACS archives, you have to look hard and deep to understand this first uprising, if you want to call it that, against the ACS, against the American Colonization Society. So what was this little rebellion? The Remonstrants, it's the name I'm giving it. They basically arrest Ashman and redivide some of the supplies, etc., to take it upon themselves to do that. And Ashman is there instructing them, I'm going to decide who gets what and how we're going to, and for them, the bigger issue actually was plots of land, how we're going to divide these things. And folks tell Ashman to go to hell. Ashman, to save his life, jumps on a boat, a ship that's in the harbor, and he flees and he goes to Cape Verde, and he stays there until Ralph Gurley, who's the secretary of the ACS, comes from Washington, D.C., meets him there. And then they come back, and Gurley is then in negotiation with these folks in Monrovia over how to solve this problem that they had with Ashman before they would accept Ashman. Now the letter, they wrote a letter to the ACS, which they sent. This letter is lost. And historians over the 100 years have been looking for it. The letter is lost. Luckily, what we have is the reply to the letter. And so if you see the reply of the ACS, the official reply of the ACS to this letter, explaining, these Black people explaining what their desires and demands are, you can read between the lines to understand what we're saying to the ACS. We in Africa, we are Black people. We will decide for ourselves what we want to do. Y'all can go to hell if you need it. But we can also compromise with you. So ACS in that reply is going point by point. We don't agree with this, but okay, so and so could happen. And so when Ashman now, when Gurley brings Ashman back, they change the charter that the ACS had sent them with originally, change it completely, because in the ACS's original conceptualization of how things would work, everybody would report to the governor would have complete power over everything. There's no council or anything like that. They changed the charter, and now that new charter said, okay, we're going to elect a council. The governor has to consult the council, and the council basically can override the governor in certain sorts of circumstances. But in return, of course, the council recognizes the governor as the executive head, right? So I'm just saying to you, if you just look at that little small, what looks small, already you have issues of self-governance, independence, etc. All of those issues, all of those themes emerge in that and this is a few months later, in that very first encounter and that challenge that they make to the ACS. Two, over the course of Liberia during its colonial era period, when it's a colony of the ACS, and not the United States government, big difference, the governors who they sent, or the agents they were called first and then governors later, all these white men who they're sending never stay more than, I've gone through the list, more than 18 months on average. They're there for very short periods of time. And they leave. They leave for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them are with the people's wives and the people, or young women or single women. And these people who are there, they gang up and they like tell the ACS, move this man from here. And which you move. I'm not calling those particular names, but they're there in history. So I'm saying that these relationships are not simply relationships of white benefactors who are there, educating these people and instructing these people and civilizing, right? These are Black people who have a kind of mission of creating, and as we go on, we will see them making these arguments, becoming clear in their heads, creating this black, creating this oasis, this Black republic, right? That would be a benefit to all Black people. I mean, that's the idea anyway.
That kind of reinforces what William was asking, that if these people could change the charter, I mean, why would they not change the name Monrovia, Liberia, if it was so imposed on them? But hold that thought, let me read, because you mentioned agents. Prophet Key is asking, say Elijah Johnson was agent of the ACS and he was not Black nor white.
Elijah Johnson was a Black man. He considered himself a Black man. I'll leave it right there. If you want to get into the history, we can get into the history. In the United States of America, where Johnson was born, where he came from, they have something called the one-drop rule. One drop of Black blood, you're Black. The same way Barack Obama is Black today. That's why he's Black, even though his mother was white. In Elijah Johnson's day, it was the same story. J.J. Roberts' day, it was the same story. And we can get into that history of why the U.S. evolved into this dual Black-white dichotomy racially. Elijah Johnson was a Black man.
Let me bring on our callers. They've been waiting. And the first on the list, Kesali Double, you have 1 minute.
Oh, all right, Mr. Jack. Good evening. Good evening to your guests.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doc, for your level expose on the Liberian history. But what confused me is that from a layman point of view, I think the Liberian history is actually difficult to write. Way too difficult in the sense that I think it was written from a third-person point of view, because there was already a Liberia before the settlers arrived. So all of the history that we keep reading around here are things that the settlers gave to our historian to write. It was not something that the historians actually took from the settlers themselves. It was not story that they collected. It was not data that they collected on a day-to-day basis as to how those Liberians were living. So to be able to go back to collect those data that were in existence before the settlers came to Liberia, I don't know. I don't even think that our generation can actually live to see it happening, because, I mean, everything we are reading now it's difficult to put together. Where do we start from? Just renaming like Monrovia to whatever name we want to give it, it's not even a scratch on the iceberg. So I don't really know where do we go from here. Thank you very much for the time, Jad. Though my time is too short, I wanted to go further. Well, I say thank you.
Thank you, though. Let me bring in one more person. That would be Jimmy Eastman. Mr. Eastman, 1 minute.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Go ahead, Mr.
Hey,
Eastman.
Jai, thanks for the show. You, as usual, it's an intellectual show. You bring on good people. Dr. Brewer, welcome. This is Jimmy E, as you probably already guessed. But here's been the issue, Doc. There's been a wave of removing those proponents of slavery from monuments, and trying to. It's almost like we're trying to not give them any glory. So the claim now is that that Monroe was one of the advocates for slavery or separation of blacks from whites, he should not be honored in any way, not even in Liberia. This upheaval has been throughout the world. What is your take? And I did hear a caller just before me say that there's no history of Liberia pre-settlers. No, but there was. And they will give you accounts of what the Europeans, just like you tried to allude, Europeans were doing all kinds of stuff here. The Mandingo Empire had come. Some people believe that why we don't tell the history from the native indigenous people's point of view. And I think you have also talked about this thing. And I think that's what some of the callers trying to, what is the history from the native indigenous people before the coming of the settlers? I will take my answer off the phone.
Thank you, Jimmy. And for the record, you have more than 1 minute. There's a protest right now that 1 minute is too short. So go ahead, Dr. Brewer, if you can respond to the two, then we can bring in more callers.
I guess both of them are along the same theme there. So if the first, especially for the first caller, if he's got a pen, he can take down the name of Patrick Burroughs, Between the Kola Forest and the Salty Sea. Go and buy the book. It's on Amazon. Google it. PatrickBurrowes, Between the Kola Forest, KOLA Forest, and Salty Sea. And see, read and make up your mind. Who is addressing that book is addressing, I believe, that particular point of the history prior to 1820. I don't know how early you came onto the show, but that's how I started it, actually. So again, reinforcing that point, yes, it is an era to discuss Liberia and start in 1822. Big mistake. And even if you're talking about the diaspora who returns to Liberia, it's an era also to start discussing them in 1822. And it makes it as if again, Liberia is just this creation of the ACS. It is not. And even when people talk about the founders of Liberia, they talk about the folks who were the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But without Salbozo, there is no Liberia. And I want for Liberians to think about that a bit more. Without Salbozo, there's no Liberia, right? And it's not only Salbozo. We know Salbozo because he is famous, right? But there are many other people there who facilitate the coming and facilitate that arrival and facilitate who basically welcome is what I'm saying. Their brothers from abroad, and support them and teach them, right? And had those people not given them that welcome mat and had not cooperated with them, there's absolutely no way that they could have maintained and built themselves in those initial early stages. That's what I'm talking about, those initial early stages. Now, there's conflict and there's violence, side by side with cooperation and peace. Those two things coexist. I think for many folks, it's really hard to get a grip. It's either, well, you were fighting each other or you were friends with each other. No. And people speak about it when it's characterized as if we're talking about homogeneous entities here. You know, there's something called the indigenous people is like one thing, and there's something called the Congo, which is a misnomer, people, one thing, you know, and these two individuals, you know, were fighting. No, it's just way more complex, and that's what we would like to be able to unfold, and that's what history tries to do, is to sort of show the processes through which, you know, this Liberian nation. You might just look. We're talking about this whole business. Let me say that again. This whole business about the name of the capital city. It's a question of Liberia's national identity, and it's a question that people are having now, not for the first time, about their national identity and what their national symbols should be. And it's a good conversation to have, right? But it's not about how it. I mean, people want to know exactly how did it happen when it happened. It did happen the way as we're explaining it here. But folks are just trying to decide for themselves, shouldn't we kind of really, sparked by the whole, you know, business with the Black Lives Matter, you know, shouldn't we kind of like reconsider this? Well, look, in the 1970s, Mr. Tolbert, who was president, you know, we had a big national conversation again about it, about changing names. That's when Front Street in Monrovia was changed to South Wilson Street, right? And even then you had different sides about it. So it's not new. This is not new. Right. We've had commissions on the Liberian, you know, Dr. Dunn was chair of his commission on Liberian symbols and holidays and all of those things. None of this is new. None of this is new. And in the 19th century, right, they had these arguments again. You know, who are Liberian people? You know, how African are they? Are they really African? And what would symbolize their Africanness?
Do you think that then, for some reason, the clock had just stopped in the 70s, 80s with these discussions? Kind of like the clock time had just froze for a second for about 20, 30 years.
No, clock did not stop. When Doe became president, they had these discussions, right? Because when the Constitution Commission met, you know, they raised those issues again, right? I mean, it's like, so you're changing the Constitution, but why not just change these various things? And the people who were in charge of that, the folks who were running that, the folks who kind of, you know, came up with their results or recommendations, left that to the side. But these are ongoing in the you know, it's interesting, and I want to raise it too because it's all part of that same thing during the Civil War of Liberia, right? The issues of national identity were there. It wasn't explicit, but it was always at the bottom. Let me say something here to our Liberian audience. Liberia is one of the oldest nations in the world, believe it or not. And how you can say that? It just came in 1820. Look, Germany did not exist when Liberia formed into nationhood and state gets created. There's no German state. There's Prussia and Brandenburg and a whole bunch of other places. It's only with Bismarck in the late 1800s that Germany becomes a state. Italy did not exist when Liberia came into formation. Did not. Giuseppe, Garibaldi and all these people, they're the ones who, you know, they fought wars and they create the Italy later on. Liberians need to understand they're one of the older actually nationalities, but creating a nationality is a constant thing. It's a permanent. It's something going through permanent change and also, you know, transformation. It's not something that you kind of create a boom and you leave it and it goes. No, these things keep changing over time. You don't think that the people in Sierra Leone have had arguments about Freetown? Yes, they have, and the people in, you know, in all these places, all these different countries around.
I have to ask this question to the doctor, and we won't hold you to it. I would just ask you, and we won't hold you to it. If you could change the name of the capital, what would you make it? And we won't hold you to it.
Oh no, so my position is irrelevant, but I mean I can tell people my position, but my position would be irrelevant. I'm explaining the complexity of it. No, I changed the name. Of course I would, and of course, and it had a name. It had a name for hundreds of years.
What name would you put in the hat if you had a chance to put a name in the hat?
What name? What
would you put in the hat if you had a chance to put a name in the hat?
No, I'm a partisan of Ducor, clearly, because that to me that's a historic name. But again, that doesn't is neither here nor there.
Yes. No.
What is the history? What is the history of this place? Because you see, even if you started saying Ducor, right? But that also means by saying Ducor that you are also embracing that complex past of Duko itself, right? And that complex past of Duko is it's not only African, but it also is a history of slavery as well, you know, of the slave trade. It's all of those things as well that's in it, right? So it's not as if Duko now, you know, solves all the problems, and I don't think that would be the purpose. You know? It's more about, again, this question of your identity, your national identity, and even if it took us 200 years to kind of reckon and realize at the end of the day that we're not actually an extension of the United States, because that's really, to me, that's the key there. You know, that we're not an extension of the United States.
Since you've told us your position, let me state it, because we've had this argument, or the debate was here, because the reason people trying to kind of kick against that is like what others have said and have told us on this forum is, well, you are kind of erasing the history of the American Liberians.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So what in your view, what's the link between the name Monroe and the group we know today has the American Liberians?
Yeah. In fact, why should an American Liberian be proud of the place being called Monrovia?
Well, Dennis, you see,
it's going into something else, because there were names, streets, cities named after, you know, or those are free blacks that came, the blacks that came, right? The American Liberians. So changing the name, some are saying that's going to have a snowball effect to say, okay, let's change the name Benson Street, let's change the name Clay Ashland, and all that. So that means you are still going to
slippery slope. Slippery slope.
Liberians.
The slippery slope argument.
Yeah.
And those people don't realize, who make the argument, that in naming Monrovia, they've erased the history of the place. Just in naming it Monrovia has erased the history, because naming it Monrovia means that it starts in 1824 or 25, whatever that year, because it wasn't right away that they named it Monrovia. It was a few years later. In naming it Monrovia, I think it was 1824. In naming it Monrovia, they are erasing the history of what was there before Monrovia was there, right? I mean, that's another way to kind of think about that too. But I'm interested in that other point that you had made there, that they raised about, you know, erasing the so-called Americo-Liberian history. That history needs to be interrogated as well, you know, as in, like, who is an Americo-Liberian? That's not something Liberians really talk about or think about, you know, what makes a person that identity, you know, and I wouldn't even limit it to the Americo-Liberian identity, all the various identities of Liberia, you know, that come up into this, you know, this Liberian mosaic, or this, you know, this cloth that has all these different pieces of fabric that bring it together. The American Liberian identity is fluid, is not some sort of set, you know, thing. And American Liberian identity it also is a kind of is a new identity. We actually know when it gets created. You know, it's a product of. It is an African identity. It is actually, because there are no American Liberians in the United States. You agree? I mean, that's straightforward. How could you be an American Liberian and you never came to Liberia? So I'm not talking about. That's why I'm telling people, you want to be thinking historically. Let's leave today alone. Let's go back into the past. There are no American Liberians before they come to Liberia, right? That doesn't exist. When they're on the Elizabeth, there's no American Liberian on Elizabeth. When they land on Dazo Island, there's no American Liberian. In fact, there's no Liberia. They haven't even given it a name by that point. So American Liberia is something that emerges in the course of the 19th century.
So I want
out of certain contexts.
Who are born here. So I want kids who are born here, throw like a little monkey wrench in this thing. Is that if they touch the soil in Liberia and decide to repatriate to Liberia, so they're gonna be American Liberians?
Yeah. Which exactly shows you the complexity is interesting how history is, because so Liberians who have children, you know, born in the United States, you know, are now Liberian Americans. You know, like you have Nigerian Americans and you have Ghanaian Americans. You know, they're now Liberian Americans. So are they Liberian American Liberians? I'm just sort of seeing how we can go on and on. But fact is that this identity is a socially constructed identity that comes out of that particular historical context. It is an African identity. It's a new African identity. It's a new African identity that emerges, but it has changed. That changed over time, and it has certain characteristics. We can kind of like look at those characteristics. And what's that membership? But I think what happens is that a lot of people, two things here. A lot of people confuse culture and genes, really, in a way, as if it's some sort of genetic thing, which is not. And then as well, when we talk about these identities, there are elements within the national culture, and that's why it's all national identity, that the implication in that argument about erasing Americo-Liberian identity, the implication of that argument is that the United States and what to them appears that the important necessary symbols of the United States, that United States connection is critical and key, and that if you didn't have that United States connections, they don't exist anymore. Right. That's the I think that's the really source of it, and how then they feel about this supposed link to the United States, and they want to be known in a way. You can say, the critics will say, you want to then be known as like that American stepchild, and you want that American identity. You want people to understand that you have that American connection. Yeah, that it validates your existence that way. And it's funny because as a historian, you're reading the actual words of the actual people who had been born in the United States and then moved over to Africa, and see what they have to say about America. And they're very critical of America. Read Joseph Jenkins Roberts talking about the United States. Read Hillary Teach talking about the United States. They're more critical of of America than their own children and subsequent generations that have. Right. So I think that, and I'm saying in a way that they're actually more radical. That first generation of these people are more radical than the subsequent generations who replace them and basically start to develop more the kind of neo-colonial Liberian state that we are more familiar with, that we know now today.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, talking about that, I'm reminded of the Declaration of Independence, where some harsh words were used, But let me bring in another caller. We have 3 more callers to bring in as we wind down. Caller 0291, your name and where you calling from?
Hey, Dennis. Hi, this is James Lausa here, calling from Windsor Mill, Maryland. And
Mr. Lausa, you are live. 1 minute.
Okay.
Hello.
Thank you very much. I want to applaud Dr. Brewer for what is an excellent presentation. However, I would just like to make some pointers. I know he wouldn't just have everything at his fingertips. That wouldn't mean that he's not authority in that. That the ACS was composed of not only whites, but whites and blacks. In fact, it was an entity in Liberia that was meant to transition a partnership between whites and blacks to a completely black entity, which is the government of Liberia from the Commonwealth. So decisions made were not only made by whites, but by both blacks and whites. And secondly, I want to say that the Liberian people are basically victims from 2 different forces. One is a group running away from America from the harsh treatment of slavery from America going back. And the other one is the other group running away from the Mali Empire, where they were all one people, and the chief ethnic group there had converted to Islam, and they started forcing them to become Muslims, and they started running away, coming to Liberia. So the Liberian idea is a product of people who are running away in search of freedom, okay? So Monrovia, again, is simply a 75-mile land that is like 1 cent of $100 if we were to compare the land mass of Liberia in monetary terms. If at all we feel aggrieved, I call that, hidden grievance or grievance politics, if we feel so aggrieved that we don't need a capital to be called Monrovia, then let us go, as we have said, the land mass of Liberia is very deep, it's virgin. We have Bonjaman, Kulahun, Bolahun, Banga, Capeta, Ganta. Let us go. Ellen Johnson, recently when she was there, designated a piece of land bordering among Bong, Nima, and Grand Bassa that will be developed into a new capital city called Zekepa. If you have issue with your capital city being called Monrovia,
go build your own place. But that Monrovia land is just so small and doesn't deserve to take so much time of us unless our motive was based on power play and dominance over a small group of people who are the remnants of the free blacks who came from America. This power play is not good. It divisive and it's distraction. Thank you very much, Dennis, and I just want to make that point clear.
Thank you, James. And Dr. Brewer, please mark that down. That's James Lassa, former board chairman of EULA. Let me bring in Professor Larry Davis. Professor Davis, you are live.
Hi, Dennis. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Go ahead. You're live, sir.
Great. I'll be brief. Great. I'll be very brief. Thanks so much for your show. And William, I hope you're doing well. Wanted to ask Professor Brewer here if he could specifically explain the contributions of the settlers that came from America to the development of Liberia. I want to know specifically how they shaped and formed the country that we call Liberia today. And secondly, I'm wondering who wrote the original 1847 Constitution. Could he briefly touch upon the fact of who did that? And thirdly, I'll be brief and I'll say this. And from my perspective, why I think Liberia is so unique and so important, because as you know, during the Berlin Conference, it was the only country that maintained its independence. And as I told Dennis not too long ago, when the OAU charter was drafted, it was Liberians who actually drafted the Liberian charter. I mean, the charter for the OAU charter. So anyway, I'll take my answers off the phone. And Dennis, William, thanks so much.
Thank you. Let's take our last caller for the night. 7336. Your name and where you calling from?
Hey, Dennis. This is Percy Harris. How you doing?
Good, Percy. You're live. 1 minute.
Thank you. Good evening, Professor Brewer. How you doing? Two things I want to ask you quickly before. Before the ship left New York Harbor, there was something called the Elizabeth Compact. I don't know if you heard about that. If so, I want you to elaborate on what kind of document the Elizabeth Compact was. Right? There was such a thing called the Elizabeth Compact. Secondly, I want you to talk about. You mentioned a very important time in when Ashman left for Cape Verde and Gurley came back, and there was that. You talk about that letter that I think it was probably sent by Gurley. I think those instructions for the settlement name and the name of the settlement, the entire colony. I think those information, if I'm not wrong, was sent by Gurley. It was sent by the ACS by Gurley. I want to talk about what came out of those negotiations. So if the settlers did not have a say in what the environment was going to be, they were just taking strict order. So what was the essence of that negotiation? What actually came out of that negotiation? Were those things just shoved down the throat, knowing now that if these people were saying, no, we're not just taking anything. So what came out of those negotiations? Were these names, were everything just came down the throat? Everything that came from America, the people just accepted without any say in it. I want you to elaborate further on those points. I will stop here for now. Thank you, President. Dr. Brewer, it's all yours.
Okay. Yeah, sure. A lot of stuff, good stuff. Yeah. I'm glad that people are engaged like this. Again, it's how people frame things really in these discussions that they have. There's actually a whole lot more, interesting how listening to people ask questions and raise issues here, how there's a lot of understanding and I would even dare say agreement on some basic facts. Even as at the same time there's some fundamental differences here. So the very first call had to do with the points being made about what became Liberia, this space of Black freedom, I'd call it, which I completely concur with. In fact, I maybe I didn't do as good a job in making that point about it being a space of Black freedom, and that I said before that the people who are already there facilitate the arrival and of the people who come from the diaspora, and that their cooperation ultimately is essential to the success, the maintenance of that, the getting going, the moving on and development of the project. They're absolutely essential. And I think one of the reasons why, let me speak to that a little bit more. One of the reasons why that's an issue that keeps coming up is that for people who are educated in Liberia, who go to school in Liberia, and who go through the education system in Liberia, et cetera, that is really not part of how they come to understand the Liberian history and Liberian past, right? It unfortunately, that's just the reality. If you think of somebody like A. Doris Banks Henry's or Richardson, or those sorts of books, Yancey, that were the key textbooks that educated generations who would have been living in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and that sort of thing. They grew up on storylines on narratives that painted the country in a particular way, and so people react and respond. Therefore, why don't we know this? So why do we only label things in a particular direction? And then subsequent to that, from the 1970s onwards, there's a new narrative that emerged in which, and I would say greatly influenced as well by scholarship from the United States, by American scholars, white American scholars, in which the history of Liberia is seen as a history of conflict between some entity called indigenous and an entity called Americo-Liberian, and that's kind of like that's the education that people have. And there's no place for nuance or complexity in many of those sorts of those models that are there. So that's part of what people are trying to catch up on, and I guess in a way they want to go and move beyond it. Just one other thing too about Liberia being a special place, not only as this refuge, but not only does it welcome the diaspora and these various diasporas, because we do have a Manding diaspora of that. A big part of Liberia is a Manding diaspora, but we have another group that's coming from the east, the Kru-speaking cultures that emerged and so they all kind of get together. I like the framework that Professor Boubacar Bari, the Senegalese Guinean historian, makes. He calls talking about West Africa. He can apply to Liberia. The people without frontiers is that phrase he uses, the people without frontiers, which makes absolute sense. A lot of our narratives are caught up in political scientists talk about the Westphalian state, this notion of a territorial sovereignty, and a centralized nation state that sort of operates in that territory. Whereas when you look at African history in reality, that concept is different. I mean, that concept of you're person X, and that is the land that you belong to, that place, only that place, right? And this is sovereignty who has sovereignty over you. That's a very European kind of way, not just Europe, but a newer way of thinking. When I say new, I mean 300-400 years. That's there. People moved, and people literally just moved. People moved around. That's a whole other kind of way of working through that. So even this whole business of the national identity is caught up in that as people try to work out that national identity. Which again, the first caller, his point about this was the capital in Monrovia, and I mean, I too think, or in past times thought that, what they should do is just create a new city. The Nigerians did it with Abuja, right? As a way of trying to develop the nation and at the same time balance various political claims. The people in this country, United States, did it. Washington, D.C. was not the first capital of the city, and they moved it to someplace that was sort of central between the various kinds of interests that they had. The Canadians did it. The Australians do it. The Germans, there's lots of examples of in history of those things happening, just as there are also examples of people changing names and reverting to what the names of places were. So we think of what India went through recently with Mumbai replacing Bombay. Those of you who are a little older know that they used to call, the English called it Bombay, right? And Calcutta to Chennai, going back to the older names or Kolkata and Madras into Chennai, going back to names that were called at a previous time, of course, closer to home, West Africa, Burkina Faso, etc. So, again, all of those things are issues of national identity. All of those things are issues of national identity. So people are, it's a legitimate question. It's not simply a matter of, it is that, but it's not only a matter of people doing power plays, but national identity as well is about power plays too. The fundamental question, who are we? What are we? What's our purpose? Those things. That's what's underlying. That's really what's underlying this whole debate. I think people should focus on that. It connects up to the last question about what were the contributions of the diaspora in Liberia. Immense, obviously, and obvious as well. Not just in terms of the name, but I mean every aspect, every sinew is in the sinews of the nation. That we have that fabric. He asked for specifics. He asked, the Constitution. The Constitution of Liberia originally was written by the African Americans, not by Greenleaf. Greenleaf's version of the Constitution is quite different. The most important difference is the fact that being the proto-Black nationalists that they were, being the proto-Pan-Africanists that they were, the people who wrote that original Constitution, the original ones, not the Greenleaf, insisted that Liberia citizenship would be reserved to people of African descent. Right? They insisted on that. So from all of those different angles, it just again shows you the various levels of complexity that we sort of have here. Two quick other answers here. Sorry?
The AU, the last one you mentioned, three things, the AU.
Right. OAU, I'll come to that in a minute. The previous caller asked about or mentioned the business about the ACS being multiracial, which I again acknowledge. But of course we know that the leadership is entirely a white leadership. I mean, I don't think we can sort of like quibble about that. And as I said, the ACS was an alliance, was a very unlikely alliance, but an alliance nonetheless, and a kind of marriage of convenience. There are different people having different sorts of objectives, and say, hey, look, there are a couple of things we have in common, and let's move to it. Clearly, Finley was an anti-slavery man. That's obviously clear. He is, but Henry Clay was not. So that's the history of it. The diaspora who can return to Liberia have left us actually a rich record where they're proclaiming and arguing a particular vision of what it is that they're looking for and looking at. You read Kerry's letters, and he's having these debates with African Americans who are here in the United States. They're having debates about, again, the destiny of the character and destiny of Black people, and David Walker, the great David Walker, in his pamphlet that he writes in the late 1820s. He's a big part of it is part of that. He's engaging that debate about Liberia and about this African identity. So there's a conversation that continues. Joseph Jenkins Roberts makes several trips to the United States over the course of his life. One of the last speeches he gives, a kind of summing up. He's looking back on his time and his career and his life right in Washington, D.C., to the American Colonization Society. The speech, the original one, is in the Library of Congress. And it's a fascinating sort of, speech if you kind of like look at what Roberts is saying and how he's analyzing the history of that colony and those things like that. The point, again, so if we kind of like, broaden it a little bit, the point being that there are, in history, there are of various ways of looking at it, different perspectives that people bring to the table. And I think we should consider all of those things, obviously. And what history does in that sort of large vision, what it does is that it helps inform us understanding what that past is and how people have forged their lives, how they made a way out of no way, and that is what the ancestors of today's people have done. from all walks. They made a way out of no way, creating one of the oldest nationalities, really, out of all that. The sort of ethnic identity rivalry, those sorts of things, that a lot of that stuff is of a more recent vintage that we sort of see, that we see around today. That these divisions that sort of mark, and these sort of, in many ways, these sort of like extreme, some of these conflicts that people see, a lot of that is of a more recent vintage. There's no pure anybody, and I think somebody raised the question earlier, and there was a reference to even American Liberians, but everybody else, or you Vi or Gribble, or there's no pure anybody. There's no pure Gribble person or Vi person or American Liberian person. None, does not exist. There's no ethnic purity, does not exist. Although that ideology, that people talk about it in that way, but it doesn't exist, and it's not genetic. It's not a biology thing, you being crown or you being well, it's not a genetic thing. These are social identities that people have up until today. If you study the Vi tradition, the Angola tradition, there are all kinds of competing arguments about particular individuals and events, and different perspectives are given about people. Zoluduma or Zabozo, there are different sorts of traditions that come, and we can replicate that straight through, including the very same newer identity that American Liberian identity. The Elizabeth Compact. There's no document with the word Elizabeth Compact on it. The Elizabeth Compact, for the caller who asked that question, Elizabeth Compact is a name that historians put to the instructions that the ACS was given to the agents, right? Because they kind of wanted it to sound like the Mayflower Compact. So they came with the Elizabeth Compact. These are people having their own delusions of grandeur, so that Liberia was a little America and was following the same pattern. I think it's nonsense. Let me just be honest about that. But that's what they were doing. These things are fluid, right? And again, people should stop seeing what happened in the past as, things are like everybody knew what was going on. Things were clear, and folks just went from one thing to the next and they went down their list. No, there's a lot of back and forth. It's dynamic, like things are today in the world that we live in today. We don't know if Trump will win the election or not in November. If he wins the election, people will be saying, oh yeah, we knew this was going to happen. If he loses the election, people will say, oh yeah, we knew that this was going to happen. No, we don't know. And likewise, the people who are existing at the time didn't know. Didn't know about the things that are happening. There were comments about the more recent, come to your OAU very quickly here to close it, about the contributions. We've been talking about the 19th century. We really haven't looked at the 20th century at all. And the Berlin Conference, from the Berlin Conference to 1960, that's sort of century. Right. That's a kind of, I think, I would argue that that's a whole other story.
Right, exactly.
That there's a different kind of Liberia, really, and that there's an early republic, which basically is that period, of the arrival of the diaspora. Up until the Berlin Conference, basically, and then the trajectory of the Liberian nation and the state just is completely changed in the second century. It completely changes, and of course, Liberia is in the thick of things. Obviously, it would be, and where it stands and what it represents and symbolizes throughout. It's a whole other kind of issue. Sure. What happens, but it's just and it's generations, etc. And I'm just saying that first generation of Liberians, and that first generation includes both the diaspora and people who then joined, the African people who are there who joined them. That first generation need their own history and need to be set apart, identified, and understood more. Because what we're guilty of is that we keep looking at them through our lens, rather than looking at them on their own terms.
At their own time and place. Thank you so much, Dr. Bulowo. Our time is fast spent and we need to be winding down. So let's have your closing comments on this and then we can close the broadcast. Or William, you want to say something first?
No, that's...
Yeah, all right. Dr. Bulowo, let's get your closing comments because our time is fast spent. We want to be able to have you back, so we don't want to take all your time.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak and to talk at any time. Again, my Liberia has a fascinating history, and Liberia is very central to the development. It has a great impact. Its history to development of Black people and throughout the world globally, and its history is intertwined inextricably with the history of the freedom struggles of Africans, of Blacks around the world, including the United States. And it would be, great for Liberians to come to a greater appreciation of the sorts of struggles and sacrifices, etc., the legacies, great legacies that their people have made, and that they're big, complex, complicated family that's there, and we should all embrace that history, the good parts of it, the bad parts of it, everything, all of that. So yeah, it's a pleasure, and be glad to come back.
Thank you so much. William?
No, thank you so much, Dr. Herbert. Like Dennis said, we love to have you come back on. You bring up a lot of questions, the comments and everything. Folks keep having a lot of stuff to say, but our time is far spent. So once again, thank you so much. We look forward to having you back again to dissect maybe some of the different pieces. Dennis?
Until then, from all of us here at Focus on Liberia, I want to remind you that we are all Liberians, and that's why we always end with that song. The last time when Dr. Bro was here and we talked about the Liberian history, at the end of it, I wrote a poem and I just posted it, which says, Liberia means freedom. For the sake of those who did not hear it, because we have to reinforce that we are all Liberians and that we all came to Liberia, the place called Liberia, running away from something or in search of something, freedom. So this is what I wrote a year ago. Liberia means freedom. They came from the north, east, and west. Many of them came on foot through the jungles. Others came in boats, canoes, and ships through the waters, all seeking refuge from war, dominance, bondage, and threats. They wanted to be free, left alone to enjoy life and thrive. The Gola, Vi, and the Kisi were the early birds. The Glebo, Clow, and Kua with all their cousins. The Mandingo, Man, Dan, Bandi, and more. The former slaves and those rescued from slave ships all converged on a land that would symbolize freedom. For this purpose, a Pan-African nation was built, a country born out of the need for deliverance from all evil. No matter how and when they came, freedom was the goal. And that is how Liberia came to be, and so must it be, the glorious land of liberty by God's command. On that note, we want to say thank you so much for joining us, and let us all try to make Liberia that glorious land of liberty. From all of us here at Focus on Liberia, we say good night and God bless you.
We are Liberia. Liberia is our home.